What events in your own history led you to become a behavior analyst?
That's not a short answer. I was an infantry platoon leader in the war way back there in the 1940s. I made the world safe for democracy again. We're doing that all the time now.
Well, thank you very much.
And I ended up in Berlin at the end of the war. We were, incidentally, when we declared victory on that occasion, the first thing we did was take their guns away. This seems to be something the present administration doesn't think is necessary. But it helps if you take their guns away, believe me. And we were beginning to rebuild the store when I got transferred from Berlin and from the infantry to the 317th Station Hospital in Wiesbaden, Germany, which was the neuropsychiatric center of the European Command. Someone had been looking up the records, and they saw that I had taken a course in psychology. And they transferred me to this neuropsychiatric hospital, and I was the chief clinical psychologist of the European Command, just like that. So I spent 2 years there in a psychiatric hospital. One of the most striking things I saw there was we didn't have much in the American. Remember, this is the middle 40s. There wasn't much in the way of treatment. Not all the drugs that exist now. There were insulin. There was electroconvulsive shock, and there were the tubs. You would put people into straitjackets and put them in run warm water over them. Very, very soothing. But electroconvulsive shock was very popular. And what I observed there very quickly was that this was used a great deal on patients who had what we used to call reactive depression. This is a disorder presumably related to situational matters. If you let them alone for 2 or 3 weeks, it goes away and so on. But if you plug them into the light circuit and give them electroconvulsive shock, they get up and go away in a few days, and they're looking very good. After a couple of years at the Neuropsychiatric Center of the European Command, I was sent back to the University of Chicago. They finally realized that I didn't know what I was doing, and they sent me back there to be trained. But I learned a few things while I was there. And one of the, there was a new program established. This was in the mid-1947, 1948. A core curriculum. A new chairman had come into the psychology department in Chicago, James Greer Miller, and a whole new faculty. And they established, everything was in a hurry then. A lot of people coming out of the service. The Veterans Administration had established big programs because they had a lot of people and they didn't have any trained professionals. The Veterans Administration were responsible, I think, for professionalizing psychology to a considerable extent. At any rate, this program at Chicago was intended to move things along quickly so that we could get more professionals out there working. And the core curriculum required that we cover the whole of psychology in 9 months. That was the core. And then take a comprehensive exam, and that would qualify you for your advanced PhD training. But in addition to covering the whole of psychology in 9 months, we had to replicate an experiment in the psychology literature find some experiment that we thought was good and redo it to do it. Now, if you think that's easy, you should try that sometime. Most of the experiments are not replicable. But the experiment I found was a paper by Estes and Skinner in 1941 on conditioned anxiety. And this looked to me like a perfect model for the sort of thing I had seen in Germany in the psychiatric hospital. But the important thing was that this was an experimental method to replicate this in the laboratory and study it. And that's what got me into behavior analysis. That paper, which you're far too young to remember, demonstrated this was done with rats, and they had been trained to press a lever on a variable interval schedule for a food reward. And in the middle of their daily work day, a clicking noise had been turned on, and 3 minutes later, they received a shock through the feet, superimposed upon the daily work schedule. Now, this seemed to me to be precisely the kind of model we see in the psychiatric disorder. Patients present themselves for help because their normal daily routine is disrupted. When you perform that particular combination of things, the rat is in there working away, getting his daily bread, essentially. When the clicker comes on, after a few pairings of clicker and shock, he stops pressing the lever completely, has piloerection, defecates in the cage, so on and so forth. At the end of the 3 minutes, he takes his shock through the feet, and he goes back to work. Well, this looked to me like a pretty good model for, So that's the experiment I replicated, and that's what got me into essentially behavior analysis. And that was in 1946, 1947. The most important thing was that it wasn't easy to replicate. If you ever get a chance to look at that paper, you will find something very remarkable. This is Skinner, Estes and Skinner, and the data they published was an average curve, would you believe? Skinner had been convinced by Heron, who was one of his faculty colleagues at Minnesota, this was done, that he built 6 Skinner boxes and 6 cumulative recorders. A 7th pen averaged every time one of the 6 rats pressed the lever, the average curve, the average stepping switch moved 1/6 of the distance. So that with all of them contributing, what you got was an average curve. And they superimposed the clicker and the shock on top of this. But in order to see the suppression, you had to take the paper and hold it up this way and look. It was that. And that's, of course, the result of averaging data. It does that every time. When I replicated it, I only had 4 animals. So I treated them one at a time. The condition suppression was not that good, so I increased the shock intensity. And with my animals, every single one of them showed a complete cessation of responding and piloerection, and then went back to work. At the end of my 9-month period, I had passed my comprehensive exams. I had replicated the Estes Skinner experiment, and I had a whole summer with nothing to do. So I built an electroconvulsive shock machine, and I plugged 2 of those rats gave them a full-blown tonic-clonic convulsion 3 times a day for 7 days. The other 2 rats, I put the ear clips on them that I had, but no convulsion. And a week later, I put them back in the box, and guess what? the electroconvulsive shock had cured the 2 rats that were suppressing. They worked right on through the clicker. They didn't have any pyeloelectric,
Wow.
so on and so forth. That was the beginning of the end for me. There was no way I was ever going to do anything else in my life. A big reinforcer when you find it. So I replicated it. It's one of the few experiments in psychology that comes out the same way every time you do it. And of course I looked at a number of parameters, if you spread the shocks out over periods of time, it didn't work too well. If you compress them, just the right distribution. If you put the animals away, 30 days later, it came back. And that's essentially the way electroconvulsive shock is as well. So that's how I got into, when I left Chicago, I came to Walter Reed, where the Neuropsychiatric Center, an interdisciplinary research project was just beginning. And I was very lucky to, I've considered what my autobiography ought to be called. And the title I've decided on is The Gifts of a Fortuitous Environment. You just got to be lucky sometimes.
That's an amazing story. So what was your training like as a behavior analyst, or how were you trained?
Well, I really didn't learn anything about behavior analysis until after I finished my doctoral degree, except for this experiment I had to do. In fact, during that 2.5 years I spent in Chicago, I spent a year with Carl Rogers. I learned how to out-non-direct people. I had more training as a non-directive therapist than I did as a behavior analyst. My mentor at Chicago was Howard Hunt. Howard arrived at Chicago about the same time I did. We were actually about the same age, although he had gotten his degree before he went into the Navy, and he was doing professional work. So that when he came to Chicago, he came as an associate professor, and I came as an infantry platoon leader, as a graduate student, essentially. But he and I built the first rat boxes, the Skinner boxes together. Howard Hunt had been Bill Estes' office mate at Minnesota. So he got his degree at Minnesota when Skinner was there. So to that extent we had some connection. But Howard was a clinician. He was not an experimental psychologist. Although he was very smart and he knew what Skinner was doing. The extent of my formal training was through reading as a graduate student and this one experiment. But I had no courses in the experiment. Well, there were no courses in the experimental analysis. We just made that up. Over the past 40 years it's appeared, but it was traditional psychology.
I see.
What was big in those days, of course, was learning theory. Everybody was. I remember I was in charge of the senior seminar when I was an advanced graduate student, and we had sponsored a learning symposium in which Tolman, Hull, Skinner, and Guthrie all came to the University of Chicago and gave talks one day.
Wow.
Now, you can't imagine what that was like.
Yeah.
Because we'd been, as graduate students, we'd been busy swallowing all of this stuff. And then all of these great men appeared on the same day at Chicago. That's the one thing I remember about, and of course, Skinner. Tolman, Hull, and Guthrie were giving theories like mad, and Skinner got up and said, theories aren't necessary. And that was a great day, and I believe that's true.
That leads us pretty well to the next question. So what was it like to be a behavior analyst during your early years in the field? I know you've already sort of talked about that, but if there's anything else you'd like to add, or I know you mentioned you're sort of...
Well, there were only 3 or 4 of us. That's it. The only thing I remember, it was it's interesting because I had moved to the East Coast, and since I was at the first truly interdisciplinary neuroscience laboratory, we had anatomists and physiologists and endocrinologists and psychiatrists. We were all put together in a laboratory that was too small for us. But as the experimental psychologist in the group, I had the option of, now you got to remember this was in the 1950s, and we had a lot of trouble with, we were in one war or another. I think it was the Korean War then. Yeah. We also had McCarthy, who was making trouble for everybody. But we had the opportunity to both hire people, and the draft was working then. The people had to come into the service. So that we were extremely lucky at Walter Reed. I was able to bring into the laboratory the people who had been trained at Harvard with Skinner, and I had Dick Herrnstein, for example, was one of my people, was a private in the Army. Murray Sidman, who's here, was one of my early people at Walter Reed. John Boren. We had, a whole host of people from both places. So we became sort of a center for behavior analysis, although it wasn't thought of in those days. This was just experimental psychology. But it was not, it was certainly not mainstream psychology. I had Charlie Furster and Izzy Golddiamond. All of those people were with us in Washington at one time in the 50s. So much so that one of the jokes I remember at the West Coast, someone told me that operant conditioning was considered an Eastern Jewish movement. So an Eastern Jewish movement is operant conditioning. So that's what it was like in the early days. We were considered an out-group, essentially, in large part, and not very well. Now it's, I think, mainstream.
Yeah, I think it would probably more so described as like a dream team to me. It sounds like.
That's exactly right. We had the dream team at that. The nice thing about Walter Reed, as I say, we had the people. General Hershey was in the draft was recruiting for us, so it was sort of the melting pot of all the people that came from Columbia and Harvard. Ended up doing essentially postdocs with me at Walter Reed, and it was sort of like the blind leading the blind. We didn't know what we were doing, but we were having fun. That we knew anyway. And strangely enough, it was the Army that was supporting us. The one remarkable thing about this, I remember, is that we had no idea what the budget was. All we did, they just asked whatever you needed, we told them and they got it for us. And we didn't have to worry about space or the lab. We just, those were the good old days.
They sound pretty good to me.
Doesn't happen that way anymore.
No, not at all. So what do you consider your most important contributions to behavior analysis, or what would you like to be remembered for the most?
I was talking to Sigrid last night. I think of myself as a participant cheerleader for the applied operant. I mean, most of these guys have made great fundamental contributions. Most of my activities have been on applying what they have done to solve problems, essentially. Beginning with the CER, the conditioned emotional response. And when I got the effect of electroconvulsive shock, which turned out to be my dissertation, that was the other remarkable thing about this. By the end of that first summer, not only had I passed my comps and met the requirements, I had a dissertation. Just those 2 rats that were cured immediately told me that no one had done that before, and I thought this was fine, so I replicated that a few times and got that done. When we were done, after the dissertation was finished, there was a number of unanswered questions. For example, if I could cure this conditioned emotional response with electroconvulsive shock, was it the electricity or the convulsion that was the active ingredient, which necessary? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions? And that's what got me into behavioral pharmacology. I was told that I was trying to separate the electric part of this treatment from the convulsion, that you could produce convulsions chemically. Metrazole and strychnine, for example, are 2 convulsants. Metrazole is a central consultant. Strychnine is a spinal cord consultant. And so I went to the pharmacologist in Chicago, and they gave me some strychnine and metrazole and told me about convulsive doses. What they didn't tell me, and what I had to learn for myself, was that the convulsive dose of those 2 drugs and the LD50, the dose that kills 50% of the animal, was very close. So that I killed a lot of animals. And then I finally figured out an easier way to do that, a more primitive way, something called audiogenic seizures. Do you know about audiogenic seizures?
I don't.
Well, if you take a rat, these are Sprague Dolly rats, and put them in a big garbage can, and then get a set of keys and jiggle the keys over the top of the rat in the garbage can. You divide a group of rats into 3 separate categories. Some rats look up at you at the keys and say, "What are you doing there?" A second group of rats has something called a running fit. They race around the can, so on and so forth. And the third group of rats has a full-blown tonic-clonic convulsion. And these are called audiogenic seizures. Some of those rats also have a running fit first, but the thing that distinguishes them is that they all have full-blown tonic-clonic convulsions. So I figured out a way now to get convulsions without the electricity and to have controls, because the animals that didn't convulse were good controls, but they had the same treatment essentially. And only the animals that had the full-blown tonic-clonic convulsion showed the attenuation of the conditioned emotional response. In other words, the operant procedures gave me a method for studying things that we went. Now, of course, the drugs became very important. In the 1950s at Walter Reed, the tranquilizers appeared. And this completely changed the scene of treatment, psychiatric treatment. And I found that reserpine produced the same effect as electroconvulsive shock in my conditioned suppression animals. And in the early 1950s, I published a paper in Science showing that the conditioned suppression, conditioned emotional response, was differentially affected by um, amphetamine, which was a stimulant, and reserpine. The amphetamine made them more, suppressed them even more.
Mm-hmm.
The reserpine, they worked right on through the clicker and so on. That particular paper produced a stir in the pharmaceutical industry. I had calls from Merck, from Eli Lilly, wanted to, I go out and gave talks. And they all had, hundreds of compounds on the shelf that they didn't know whether they were going to, how they could screen them.
Mm-hmm.
And this became a method by which they could now, the pharmacologists could now take a look at a behavioral effect in a lab that would predict, hopefully, what would happen in the clinic. And this established every one of the drug industry is a Me Too industry. The first year chlorpromazine was put on the market in the 1950s. SmithKline and French grossed $75 million. And of course, every drug company in the country immediately wanted one of those. Now, $75 million is small change these days. Mm-hmm. They keep that in the petty cash drawer. It takes them $200 to $300 million a drug to get it to the market. That's it. And they start with the screening procedures and so on. The main point here is that all of our friends and relatives now, we got a lot of people got jobs setting up laboratories in the drug houses. And most of those guys came from Walter Reed. They were from the postdocs, Herb Geller, John Bohr, and so on and so forth, went to drug industry. So the methodology again became
the hallmark.
Became the hallmark. Now, the use of drugs or the screening of drugs for those kind of effects also opened up a whole new area as well, drug abuse. And the same drugs that turned out to be useful therapeutically also had abuse liability in many respects. And the whole domain of alcoholism and drug abuse changed dramatically when it was demonstrated in an operant conditioning lab that animals would self-administer drugs. And this was discovered by one of my postdocs, actually one undergraduate, Bob Schuster, and Travis Thompson, where Travis was my first postdoc. Schuster was my first PhD. He ultimately became the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. But they were fooling around one day with, giving drugs to a monkey to see whether he could discriminate that they had given him this drug rather than that drug. And the monkey started pressing the lever to get the drug. And the effect of that was when it was discovered that animals could self-administer drugs in an operant conditioning paradigm, a conceptual change occurred in the alcoholism and drug abuse field. The traditional view of substance abuse was that the abuser had always been driven into this terrible condition. Antecedents were very important. W.C. Fields, famous comment, "It was a woman who drove me to drink, and I never got a chance to thank her." Well, that was the prevailing view of how people got. When monkeys, without mother-in-laws, began self-administering drugs, there was a paradigm shift from looking at the antecedents to looking at consequences. And now the only treatments that make any difference in the drug abuse field are looking at consequences. Higgins and the whole group up in Vermont are all doing drug abuse. But now the effects on what the consequences of drug, the reinforcing effect of drugs. And this came out of, you know, applying operant conditioning procedures. One day, while I was peacefully giving ulcers to executive monkeys, again using Sigmund avoidance procedures at Walter Reed, I got a visit from a gentleman called Werner von Braun. Now, you're too young to remember who Werner von Braun was, but he was a famous German scientist who developed the V-rockets. And when I had come to London on my way to making the world safe for democracy, Werner von Braun was sending V-bombs from Berlin into London. And that was my first contact with him. It wasn't a personal one, but it was a real one. About 10 years later, well, when we won that war, we captured Werner von Braun, and we brought him to this country, and we let him bring 100 scientists with him. And we sent him down to Alabama, and we put him in charge of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. Is this a great country or what? They take this guy. And he, right after, it was around 1956, the Russians had just flown the dog in the Laika in the first space flight. And Werner von Braun came to Walter Reed and asked me whether or not I would be willing to put one of my livestock, we were training monkeys, into the nose cone of one of his rockets. He referred to the monkey as livestock. So I said, well, I didn't know much about putting monkeys in the nose cone of a rocket, but as long as they came back livestock, I'd be willing to try. So we trained a monkey, Abel and Baker, 2 monkeys, using they put an electrode on their toe. The monkey, incidentally, in a nose cone of a rocket, you get a lot of vibration. So we put the monkey in a plaster cast to keep him from rocking around, and they left one toe out and one finger. And we put an electrode on the toe, and we programmed an electric shock to that electrode once every 30 seconds. And we put a little lever on the finger, and every time the animal pressed the lever, he reset the timer. It takes the monkey about 15 seconds to figure this out. And we trained these animals on Sigmund avoidance. They flew up 300 miles, 10,000 miles an hour, came back, and the ocean picked them up, pressing the lever all the way. Sigmund avoidance one more time. So, and then I trained Abe, and then next was Ham and Enos. These were the 2 chimpanzees. These were the animal pretest flights of Project Mercury. Incidentally, those first experiments we did with Werner von Braun in the mid-1950s, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration didn't even exist. The first space programs were done by the Army. And the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, because this guy knew how to build rockets, you know, that would go up into space. In 1960, when NASA came into existence, the animal pre-test flights, they wanted to send some animals before John Glenn and Shepard went, and the decision was to send the chimpanzee. This was a decision made at a meeting that I was sent to by the Army. Since NASA had no facilities, they asked the Defense Department to take care of the animal pretest flights. The Navy and the Air Force were dying to get this. They knew that this is where the future was. The Army didn't give a damn. So they sent me. The Navy sent an admiral, Graybeal. The Air Force sent a general, Fleckenshire, and the Army sent me. I think I was a captain. But neither the admiral nor the general knew how to train a chimpanzee. So we ended up with the job of training. So I trained Ham and Enos. We flew them on an orbital flight so that they orbited the Earth 4 times, came back in good shape, working a matching to sample procedure, using again an operant procedure and matching to sample and so on. So that's why I regard myself as a cheerleader for the applied operant. There are lots of things you can learn by having a method that makes it. The drug abuse business, for example, I now have a mobile drug abuse treatment program that I run in Baltimore. I have 600 patients, and it was built upon our response cost principle. Working in the laboratory with the monkeys, we knew about drug self-administration, and we knew about progressive ratios and response costs and so on. There hadn't been a new drug abuse treatment program in the city of Baltimore in 20 years. And this is I guess the best way to put it is that everybody wants drug abuse treated, but not in their backyard. Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. That's one of them. So the people who don't want drug abuse treated, all the drug abusers are in their backyard. But if you put a treatment program there, you're going to ruin the neighborhood. And it's always puzzled me. So I got the idea of doing this on a mobile basis, because there's another interesting treatment about drug abuse. Methadone, which is a very effective way to manage folks who have opiate addictions. They have to come every day to get their drug. You can't take home. If you have to take 2 trolley cars and a bus to get there, that behavior gets weak very quickly. So it's a response. And the traditional methadone program loses 40–50% of their patients within the first month to 2 months. The behavior gets weak. So that's why I got the mobile treatment idea of taking the mountain to Mohammed, essentially. And I got the National Institute on Drug Abuse gave me a demonstration grant for $5 million, and we set up a mobile treatment program. I had trouble finding places to park. I went around talking to all the community groups in Baltimore and explaining to them why we thought this was important to do, and they all say, "It's a great idea. Why don't you park it way over there?" They didn't want the bus to stop on their corner. So finally I got to the clergy in Baltimore and explained to them that I was doing the work of the Lord, and we now park in the churchyards, but never on Sunday. So all week long the churchyards are open. We can pull the vehicle in there. The patients come, we medicate them, we pull out of there. The thing that people object to in drug abuse treatment, of course, is that the clientele come to a storefront and then they don't go away. They hang out there, So, but with the mobile treatment, we just move on and they're gone, and so on and so on. The most important thing about this is because the response cost is low, we have the best retention program of any program in the city of Baltimore, as we keep most of our patients. And this is based again on operant principles of ratio strain, things of that sort that we built, so on. So this is the way I've spent my life for the past 60 years, one kind of application or another, all of which based upon the principles that we learn in behavior analysis. What else can I say?
So how do you think the field of behavior analysis has changed over the years of your career?
Well, it's become obviously more mainstream, and I think it's gradual. It's certainly this has been more apparent to me recently. It's replacing pop psychology. Most of what we used to hear coming over the airways was pop psychology, essentially, people making up things about the way. Now, if you take a look at the things which are essentially many of the TV programs, like the Dog Whisperer. There's a woman who does things, and there's Dr. what's his name? Dr. Phil, so on. These are clearly behaviorally based prescriptions that we're looking at, and this has been a dramatic change over what we've seen even 10, 15 years ago, in terms of the way people would approach problem-solving issues. And the answer to that is very simple. It's the same as the answer to why I subscribe to the scientific method. It works. I'm an empiricist, or a pragmatist in a very real sense, and I think that's what's finally become apparent. That is, we're not outliers any longer. That's how I think the change has occurred. It's getting close to being mainstream, and for the pragmatic reason that it works in general now. And it has a good scientific base. Some years ago, I was asked to give we have at Johns Hopkins, we had a series called the Christmas Lectures, in which we brought some kids in, local high school kids, and we gave them, during the Christmas holidays, we offered them lectures. And I was asked to give the lecture on how scientists study behavior. And I knew that was going to be a different, this is a group that very hard to make, almost as hard to make contact with as the medical students that I trained most of the time. They don't think this is their business, which is wrong, of course. It's all of our business. But I was challenged with the high school kids. How do you make contact with their repertoire to get this across? So I decided to, I said science is a club. They understand clubs. And I said, like all clubs, this club has certain rules. And if you want to belong to this club, you have to follow these rules. Basically, the rules are three basic rules. First one is that the phenomena you deal with has to be observable. Maybe not directly, but you have to have a good one-to-one measure for it. For example, we don't observe heart rate directly. We can, but we don't. But we have a good one-to-one measure for heart rate and so on. That's the first rule. You have to deal with observables. The second rule is that you have to be very explicit about the methods you use to make those observations. So much so that the third rule is possible, and that is that someone else, using exactly the methods you took, and it may have to be somebody else in the club, because somebody else has to know how to do these things, but someone else using the same methods that you made explicit observed the same thing, replication. Those are the three rules of the science club. Now, I said there are lots of other clubs studying behavior. There's the music club, which is interested in it. There's the art club. There's the literature club. There's the religion club. but they have different rules.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be very hard to make the observable rule stick in the religion club, for example. We've been making things up there for years. But why do you want to belong to the science club as opposed to all these other clubs? It's the only club that produces cumulative knowledge. None of the, you can't argue the Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's improved on them very much over the years. The music club, Beethoven, Mozart.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody that you see, no cumulative, only in the science club is cumulative knowledge. You know, we start with some basic physics, and the first thing you know, we're flying to the moon. We've got a systematically added knowledge, so on and so forth. So one of my colleagues, Al Harris, is standing in the back when I'm laying out this new idea about the science club and whatnot. And I posed the question at the end of this. So let's see what happens if we apply these rules to the study of behavior. And I was getting ready to go through schedules and show them all those things. And Al Harris says, they throw you out of the club. And generally that's what's happened to psychology. They've thrown them out of the club because they don't deal with observables. Mm-hmm. They're making things up. They've been making them up for years and so on. So that's what's happened to behavior analysis. It's shown it's right. It makes things come out. It works. That's the main thing I would say about it, and that's why it's going to be all right.
So regarding the field of behavior analysis, what areas would you like to see more work being done in, or more research, or more applied work?
Well, I'm trying to think of what would, if I were to prioritize things. I think I've been thinking about the major problems in the world, as I see them at the moment, are a function of child rearing practices. All of the bloody problems we have with these great differences between us and the Islamic people and the terrorists and so on. The major, if you think about how does someone get to the point where they're willing to be a suicide just to the major influences upon the behavior of most of the people of the world, including us, occurs in their environment and in their parenting. And I think that's the area that the child rearing practices are the place where I think we've got to make our interventions if we're going to stop this. I mean, I thought about myself. Try to remember what it was like when you're 4, 5, even 6, 7 years old. The only contacts you have of any significance are with your parents. Now, when they tell you that this is the way things are, you have no basis for arguing with them at all. You have no leverage. You believe it. And, you know, if someone tells you now, what you're going to do is grow up to be a suicide guy, and then you're going to end up in heaven with 40 virgins waiting for you, they believe that. And you laugh now. But think of yourself at age 6. You have no basis for not believing anything. And, you know, we're just looking at another whole problem out here now. Where is this, in Utah, where they're doing DNA on 400 kids to find out who their fathers were? This is a, you know, polygamous society. So I guess if I were looking to save the world using behavior analysis, the place to start, I'm convinced, is with child rearing. and the influence that parents have, or whatever the community is, has upon a child. I always remember I was brought up as a Catholic, and it was Pope Pius X who said, "Give me a child till the age of 7, and I defy you to take him away from me." This guy knew something. It's true.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the influence that you have over kids at that age, they have no basis for believing anything else but what you tell them.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, you control all their reinforcers. You're feeding them.
Mm-hmm.
And so on. So I guess that's the area I would like to see. I don't know quite exactly how to do this, but I know that that's the most important thing I see for generating a more peaceful society. So.
And so what do you see as the future of behavior analysis, or where do you see the field going?
Well, it's obviously expanding by leaps and bounds.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at ABBA, for example, there were only 3 or 4. Well, I think ABBA began as a group that met. This was in the late 40s, early 50s. There was a group at Indiana and Harvard that I attended. They met once a year as an informal little group. Skinner and Dinsmore and Verplank and a few people like that. Nat Schoenfeld. And I remember going to Indiana once and to Harvard once. We met once a year. You know, if there were 6 or 8 people, there were a lot of people. And all you got to do is look at ABBA today, and you'll know which way, you know, where I think it's going. And as I say, if I were looking at areas that I'd like to see developed, it would be in that child development range and so on. And the answer to why it's going to go, because it works. It's going to continue to work, obviously. So.
And maybe one personal question, if you could just talk about for a minute or two. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I've read a lot of the studies on the 3-person simulated environment, and also related to the military space exploration.
Well, that's the programmed environment came out of the space research when, after we flew the 2 chimpanzees, Ham and Enoch, and then Shepard and Glenn followed. There were 6 astronauts, and I was all ready to really do some flight research now. But as soon as the astronauts took over the program, which they did at that point, research stopped completely. These guys were all test pilots, and anytime they saw a guy coming close by with a white coat on, they ran. They would have nothing to do with it. Their view was, when I approached about, let's do it, we've already passed the test. We're not taking any more tests. And they wouldn't participate in experiments. They ran the program, and until recently. Now there are payload specialists, MDs and PhDs are flying, and I did publish an experiment. Tom Kelly and I just published in JAB a year or 2 ago. We did have one flight experiment. But during that 30-year hiatus, when I couldn't get on board because we went back and simulated the programmed environment, assuming that when we really went into Mars and Luna missions, which we're doing now, that this is what we should be prepared with, you know, how to program the environment. It didn't go over too well. This was the 1960s. Now, you don't remember the 1960s, but let me tell you, you didn't want to be in the behavior control business. Everybody was doing their own thing, including my own kids. You know. And they would tell me, well, you know, what you should do is go out in the desert and let the world act upon you. And I say, you know what happens when you let the world act upon you? it squishes you every time. You got to act on the world. It makes it like that. But that's where the programmed environment came from. It was, they wouldn't let us fly anymore, so we simulated it, and Jack Findlay and I built that.
I'm a huge fan of that research. And then
yeah, but it fell into disrepute because the 60s, first thing you know, they were giving me money to, it was like giving me a subsidy not to grow cotton. If you don't do that, research will give you money to do this. And they were back. And now, all of a sudden, we're back looking at that same sort of thing. 20 years ago, we would have been ready now, but...
So what message would you like to send to the students of behavior analysis for the future?
Pardon, what was that one?
What message would you like to send to students of behavior analysis for the future?
Just keep making responses. You can't get reinforced. You don't make responses.
Well, that's a good one.
That's right. I mean, you know, there's no end of applications. That every time you turn around, you find some way to think. This is it's the propedeutic science. If they don't know what that means, they better go find out. Take a look at the dictionary. You know what the word propedeutic means?
I do not. I better go look it up.
Right. Well, behavior analysis is the propedeutic science. It's the preparatory. If you look at scientific behavior, you can't understand it unless you understand behavior analysis, because it is essentially the set of principles which governs all interactions between organism and environment. And the scientific behavior is part of that too. So behavior analysis is the propedeutic science, in my view. It's the preparatory, basically preparatory. If you're not prepared in behavior analysis for almost any area you go into, this is the domain which you should understand first. The problem I had, the medical students, of course, are always oriented toward many other things. I've tried to point out to them that if with the exception of those of you who are going into pathology, who sit there all day long looking at slides, every other discipline in medicine, you will spend 90% of your time talking to patients, interacting with them in some way. Now, indeed, you're going to have tests and you're going to do that, but the basic phenomenon you deal with is behavioral. And you should understand something about how that it's the propedeutic science, essentially. So we shall see.
Well, it's been great to sit and listen to what you have to say about behavior analysis and your history, and I'd like to thank you very much for coming in.
You're quite welcome.
Very nice to meet you.
Okay.